Arise, go, sell all you possess. Give it directly, personally to the poor. Take up my cross, their cross, and follow me. Going to the poor, being one with them, one with me. Little, be always little, simple, poor, childlike. Preach the gospel with your life, without compromise. Listen to the Spirit, He will lead. Do little things exceedingly well for love of me. Love, 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 never counting the cost. Then go into the marketplace and stay with me. Pray, fast, pray always fast. Be hidden, be a light to your neighbor's feet, and go without fear into the depths of men's hearts. I shall be with you. Pray always, I will be your rest. I will be your rest. "25 years ago, I celebrated my first true Christmas. I was identified with Jesus for the first time. Jesus had just called me to give up everything, to live his radical love in the marketplace, according to this beautiful prophetic word from Jesus to Catherine and all those who are called to live the little mandate, which is the succinct version of the gospel, without compromise, like St. Francis. He gave me the little mandate as he did to his trusted servant, Catherine Dorothy, and as was inspired by his great friend and servant, St. Francis of Assisi, in 1205. It was a Franciscan call indeed that I was called. And what is that? It's the gospel call without compromising it as best as we can. St. Francis lived it in a very unique way in imitation of Jesus. And by doing so, he rebuilt the house of the church, as Jesus called him to do it. How? By allowing Jesus to rebuild the dwelling of his own heart and being first, and then to go among the poor as Jesus himself lived among them as their shepherd. So it was a call on my life in 1991, after a very special event in Madonna House in the Spirit, that I was called to a complete abandonment to the Father's will, his providential love for me, in imitation of his Son, and the will of the Father for his Son, to live a completely abandoned in trust. And as you already know, I was called to open a storefront 9 months after I was called to this radical disownment and this countercultural vocation to open a friendship house, again modeled after Catherine Dorothy, when she herself renounced her life and began to live the life among Christ's people. And so I entered into the great mystery of the kingdom and the King who is the shepherd of the poor. I'm so happy to hear that reading today of the Lord who is the shepherd. In fact, as I'm driving here, you know how you prepare things, Father, and you know you have a certain thing you have set and everything, and then Jesus says, throw it out the window. I've got something I'm going to say right now. I didn't prepare it for it because I wanted to be fresh. Well, this is sort of what's happening right now as I'm standing here in front of you. I realize that Jesus is changing things a little bit from my itinerary, closer to his. I mean, I hope that's the case anyway. But as I'm driving here, I saw Jesus as the shepherd, and I saw him carrying a lamb around his neck. And I was saying, Jesus, thank you. It's me. You know, you went after this lost guy here. I'm the prodigal son, and you saved me from the brambles and the thorns, and you know, you patched up my wounds. And in fact, you just didn't carry me home, so to speak. You continue to carry me. In fact, that's sort of how I understand the cross as well. You might say, I am the cross of the Lord, and he's carrying me still. You know, but all of us. But then, after that, I saw the little lamb turn into a little boy. I saw the little boy, you know, on his father's shoulders, and his hands around his neck. And I realized it was better than that. It was just like, wow, that's how I'm living. That's really how I'm living. Jesus is giving me this image several times in my life. And he reminded me again tonight, before we heard it in his word, that he goes after us. The good shepherd is a pastor. A pastor is a father to his children, to his creatures. And that is the most beautiful metaphor of our Heavenly Father, that Jesus is the perfect image of. We see the Good Shepherd revelation of who God is again and again in the Old Testament, and of course in the New Testament so many times again here tonight. But I mean, they're the earliest depictions of Jesus in the various crude Christian iconography written, you know, or scratched on the walls of the catacombs and such, was Jesus the Good Shepherd. So, again, I guess what Jesus is really wanting to get across is not that which appeals to the head and to our reason, which is, of course, very important because truth is what sets us free. But he has to first mend the broken heart. And you said it, I think it was yesterday, talk about, you know, he wants to get at that pain in the wound that he has to change to set us free in order for our lives to enter into the Spirit of God that doesn't pull us out of the Spirit of God constantly by our woundedness. And so, on the street, I began to learn how the Lord shepherds, how the Lord pastors his people. Firstly, in how I was pastored over numerous years. And then how Jesus, with me, side by side, on his shoulders, taught me how to pastor those who he would bring that I would just simply facilitate the healing of his love in their lives. And that's really what we're all called to. That's what the great pastor from Rome, Pope Francis, is talking about all the time. He is the pastor of pastors. You, my friends, are very fortunate because you have such a pastor in Father Bob. I've been around the block a few times, and I can tell a priest after the shepherd's own heart. And Father Bob is such a pastor. And that's why God is here. Father Bob's heart is in the heart of the Good Shepherd. And he is shepherding you, facilitating his healing, his salvation in your life through your pastor. And your pastor was the one who invited me here on now the second occasion to offer what Jesus would want to do to you as well through the ministry that I have been involved in for many years now with perhaps some of the poorest and broken, lonely, unloved, neglected, voiceless, but most precious of God's children. Why are the poor so precious to God? If in your family your parents had a child that was particularly ill, unwell, you would see them lavish most attention and love on that child. Sometimes to the neglect of the others. We heard it tonight. How much more Jesus rejoices over that one that was lost and wounded and destroyed by life, that he neglects the 99. His 99 other children who don't need him as much. The church has talked about the preferential treatment of the poor in Second Vatican II. Catherine Doherty heard it. Dorothy Day heard it. Mother Teresa heard it. Jean Vanier heard it. And the list goes on. Of the call to shepherd the poor with Jesus, the Good Shepherd. That's what Pope Francis is doing as the modern day Francis and, as I said, John the Baptist. There is a shepherding that Jesus did after John the Baptist. And those two roles are coming together in Pope Francis. He is calling us to repentance, and he is healing our wounds by his love, his merciful love coming to us. My friend, each one of you have been shepherded for a long time in Jesus. For a long time. Jesus has been coming after you, as he has me. I'm only speaking from my own experience, but I've come to know that my experience is no different than anyone else's. Jesus has been in your life a long time, far before you knew who he was. And he's come and got you. He's come and rescued you from so many situations already in life. If we had an evening where everyone could testify, give their witness before us all, I'm sure we would fill each evening with the testimonies of how God has rescued you, how he has shepherded you, pastored you like a father, and carried you in his arms and on his shoulders. And he indeed has given you a love that hasn't come to you in any other way in this world. No one has loved us more. The witness of Jesus, that is the witness of the Father's love, is the most perfect love there is. And what was that love? That love was that I'm ready to lay down my life. I'm ready to die for you. See, love in this world is martyred. Love in the next world is total bliss, but in this world it suffers. Parents suffer raising their children. Priests suffer pastoring their flocks. The victim souls of mothering and fathering in God is not easy. It is a martyrdom that is a white martyrdom before ever it might be blood and red. It could very well be that our Pope Francis is going to be martyred in his great shepherd's love for us. He has railed against all the corruption in his church. He has railed against his Pharisees who have alliances with the world. He has railed against the mafia, the Italian mafia. He has excommunicated them. He's come against so many corrupt agents within his own church, calling them out, not afraid. And like John the Baptist, he may lose his head because of it, but he doesn't care. He knows he's going to glory. He lives with Jesus every day. Do you remember Jesus promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against Satan? In Peter. In Peter. And because in Peter, there would be nothing that ever divides Peter with Jesus, so through the church. But we are coming to days, my friends, of an open and declared apostasy. It's brewing now. Beware of those deceitful voices that will in some way try to steer you away, steer you astray from the shepherd who is shepherding us in Jesus. Don't be fooled. Be ready to lose your life if necessary, to defend him, to stand with him. The church has gone through many trials. It's just not happened over here in the West. We've been spared wars. We've been spared a terrible persecution for being Christian. We've been spared martyrdom by and large over here in the West. So we don't know the price that so many have paid for us to have the faith. To be here tonight, to celebrate the living God in us. Catherine Doherty would tell us stories of how the Bolsheviks came into Russia exactly at the time, Fatima. As Fatima, when Our Lady appeared in Fatima, October the 13th, October the 12th, the day before, Lenin arrived from Sweden. One of the two, I can't remember. Funded by German anarchists and such, funded the whole thing. And he landed in Leningrad on the day before. He began his horrendous revolution, convincing people with his lies and deceptions of some kind of economic utopia, some promise that your life, that salvation was based on material standards, economic, financial standards. That's what Marxism is. And so, what happens now is we've come back to a world that here in the West has not known the terrible persecutions, the martyrdoms of the East. It's been spared. And because of that lack of knowledge, that ignorance, we are repeating the same things. We are following in the same errors that Our Lady said communism, atheism would spread throughout the world. Our former Pope, St. John Paul II, reminded us that militant atheism, communism, was no different than the material atheism, secular atheism of the West. The consumer atheism, the economic atheism, the technological atheism, the ideological atheisms, all of the godlessness that would spread throughout the world that began in this last century. Exactly when God intervened to tell us, prophesied to us that this was coming about, to prepare and to pray and to fast. Because the spiritual battle would be unleashed in the world like never before. And we know what the outcome was. I had the opportunity of going to Russia just after the wall came down. You could only get invited to Russia. You couldn't freely travel there. I met and befriended a bishop, an Orthodox bishop, who came on a begging tour to Canada. And I pursued him. He came down to the storefront, and we became great friends. And he began to invite me to Russia on different occasions. And it was through those invitations and my travels there that I came to hear the stories of martyrdom in our former Soviet Union countries, former Christian countries. And I was always amazed that I had not heard this. I was always so surprised that I didn't learn this. Why hadn't I learned this? Of what my brothers and sisters had suffered and died for in the East. One afternoon, the bishop asked me to give a talk of what prophetically I was seeing from the Lord in terms of the East and the West. And I had talked to him about it already, and so he invited me up on the stage and started talking about it, and I explained it in the way that I was shown. And I saw a crucifix with Orthodox clergy, and I saw them all lying down and lying around the cross dead. And then I saw another crucifix. Jesus was on another cross, and he was suffering. And underneath him, I saw a pope, and I saw other clergy. Some were dying, some were still alive, some were suffering. And the Lord gave me an explanation of the image, and he told me that what had happened in the East was going to happen in the West. That God allowed his church to be tried in this way. It is the time of the testing of the church, the judgment against the church. That's what the return of the Lord is about. It's the judgment of the church on the church, the people of God, who have either remained faithful or not. That's what happened when he first came. It was his first judgment. He came to judge the people, the Jews. Of course, there were those who converted through John the Baptist, and they were a small remnant. But the Pharisaical church, of course, his people at that time in the temple, who was in charge of the Jerusalem temple, and the head synagogue of Judea, politically conspired with Rome, as you know the story, and crucified him. So we are arriving in full circle here. What happened in Russia when the Bolsheviks came in, these political rebels who were fighting for justice and for the proletariat, proletariat, for the working man. You know, have you heard that before? The working man. And it was all a terrible revolution of hatred, so much so that Russian began killing Russian. You know the story. It became nation against nation, the kinds of things that Our Lady said was going to happen about nation would rise against nation, bishop against bishop, priest against priest. And so when the Bolsheviks came into power in Russia, Alexis II, who was the patriarch at the time, he warned his bishops, and he said, have nothing to do with them, they're godless. But there were some Judas bishops, and they made their alliances with this political new power. And all of the legitimate hierarchy of the Orthodox Church in Russia was exiled and killed. And many of them were marred, terribly marred, or brutally marred. There was one gulag. It was the Solovki Island. It was a monastery on an island, and it was especially reserved for the clergy. And they were taken there, they were starved, they were tortured, and then they were killed. It was up on a lofty height that this monastery was built with staircases down to the sea. And they would put the priests in potato sacks, and then they would throw them down the stone walk, and by the time they hit the bottom, they were just a matter of flesh and bone, flesh and bone. Or they put them in the Sardegna, the sardine can. They had a little shack, and they would put the priests into this little teeny confined space, squeezed together, and then they would lock them in. And that's how they would die, standing up. But praying for each other, praying for the world, and singing and praising God until their last breath. Some already were decaying beside those who were still there. Cruelty, hatred, and evil from former Christians who had not practiced, and therefore the evil one used the deceits, deceptions of the evil one through his political powers. So it's happened before, and it's going to happen again. Now, after I gave that talk on the stage with the bishop there, a mother gets up with her little boy and starts rushing towards the stage. And I see that she's also holding a piece of paper. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? You know how after you give a word and there's a sense of sitting with the word and that kind of thing. She just jumped up with her son and started rushing towards the stage. Went to a priest that was on the sidelines, and he nodded after she explained something. I was watching this, and she came onto the stage with me. And the translator said this. That morning, at breakfast, her little son asked her to give him a piece of paper. He wanted to draw something. And so she did that. Got his crayons out, and he drew this picture. And when he finished, she showed his mother, and she was just taken back. She was shocked by it. And so when I spoke, and she heard what the Lord was showing me through in terms of the East and Western Church, she had to come forward because the priest came and held up the piece of paper, and it was the very thing depicted that I had just spoken. 2 crosses, and those in the East, on the one cross were all dead and the other ones weren't quite, but it was the 2 crosses, the 2 crucifixions, the spiritual Golgotha of the mystical body in the East was going to become also the Golgotha, spiritual Golgotha of the mystical body in the West one day. It was 20 years ago. 20 years ago. And I see it all unfolding. So my friends, why we need in these days to know who God is, why we need to live our faith like never before, to witness Christ is risen and living in us and living in our midst and in our community, is so that we can fight off the wolves who are coming, who will use fear to terrorize us, even more so than we are now living, and to make our hands go limp, to deny Christ. It will be a test. You know, when the Bolsheviks used to come into a little village, Catherine used to tell us, and, they would come with their big propaganda machine, and, someone from the Bolsheviks would get on a table and very charismatically, if it was Stalin, or if it was Lenin, or if it was Hitler, or whatever, they had a way in which they could just grip people because there was an anger, and there was this intensity and an atmosphere of fear that they created. And as these Bolshevik speakers came into some of these small villages, you would get Mark standing up all of a sudden, and he would say, "Christ is risen!" And the whole of the congregation would say, "Truly he is risen," just as he said he would. And that was the end of the propaganda in that village. But there were some villages who didn't have a deacon Mark to stand up, ready to lay down his life for Christ, with the bold profession of faith, and the Bolsheviks would take them over. But some of these villages that did resist, they were taken into fields, a huge pit was made, and they were all assassinated together, all martyred together in a mass grave. They are still finding mass graves in Russia today. This happened. This happened in the world while we were living. This was happening. Who heard of that? That the Church of God was being crucified in its mystical body and used. Catherine Doherty was spared. Her family was spared. They came over here. Some of her members of the family were martyred, but Catherine was spared. And she became like a seed to be planted here in Canada to talk about the terrors, the hell of war, the martyrdom of war, what terrible cruelty she witnessed, near starvation, near death herself. And she, when she came to Canada, heard the gospel. It was especially inspired in her by the witness of Father Paul, founder of the Grave Wars in the States, Franciscan, holy man, and the sister, the founders of the sisters. And she became connected to them, and Father Paul became her spiritual director, and it was under his direction that she gave everything away and became a further Franciscan. And she began her apostolate on the street with the poor in her apostolate called Friendship House. And that's what I was sent out to do. And on that first Christmas, I experienced something so sublime. You know, I was a little concerned because with having anything, what would I give my family for Christmas? Can you imagine? That was what I was thinking, you know? And I thought about it for a while, and the Lord inspired me to make a homemade creche. And so I set out among the streets of the inner city around the Shepherds of Good Hope in the soup kitchen there, where I live. And I started collecting trash and the disposable things. And I started with great joy putting together this nativity scene of, I found this beautiful big wooden grape box, and popsicle sticks and twigs and rocks, small rocks, and you name roots and you name it. And then I begged for the money that I needed to go to the dollar store to buy the little creche figurines, plastic figurines, and some gold paint. It's amazing why gold paint can cover a multitude of sins and ugliness. Anyway, and so I made my little creche and I gave it to my family at Christmas, and they treasured it. 1991, and you know, 25 years. My sister still had told me recently, not too long ago, that every time she goes into storage and pulls up that creche, she says that's when Christmas begins for her. I told you about my grandfather putting up a creche in the corner of his room in the living room. And here I wanted to continue that tradition, even though I had nothing. Now it seems to be the most treasured thing the family has, that Christ inspired me to do, and that renews their faith every time. You know, when I first decided to respond with a yes to the Lord's invitation to live the life of a foolish Franciscan, my parents were not happy. My family did not agree with my life choices, and some friends too. As you can imagine, thinking I was throwing away my life, you know, and I think some of them actually thought I was, you know, wrote it off to maybe mental illness. Well, you know,